But the question we're going to explore in this next conversation is what happens once you remove the masks of religion and ideology that are cultivated by violent extremists and really get to the root of who these young people are, why they did this, and what this is all about. Is it really about religion? Is it really about ideology? Is it about something that's far more familiar to us? Take something like gangs, for instance. Gang violence kills more people in the United States than war does. And yet, ironically, we ignore that conflict at home when compared to the conflicts abroad. Today, we're going to have really what I think might actually be the first conversation between a former gang member, Paul Carrillo, who grew up in Watts and Southgate, was a gang leader at a very young age, I think 14 or 15 years old, and has now been out of the gang for 11 years and co-founded an organization called Southern California Crossroads, where he works with another great organization called A Better LA to counter the very organizations that he used to actually be part of to get kids off the street. And then we're also going to have Maajid Nawaz on stage. Maajid was a leader of a radical Islamist group called Hizb ut-Tahrir, which focuses on looking towards military coups as a way to restore the caliphate and create a global state of political Islam. Maajid was imprisoned in Egypt for 4 years and got out in 2006. When I remember this because I was working in the Bush administration at the time, Maajid's defection from Hizb ut-Tahrir shocked the world. It was the most high-profile defection from a radical Islamist group that we'd ever seen before. He founded, along with another former member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, the first think tank of former Islamists that seeks to go into the chat rooms, go into the doldrums where young people are recruited and really counter the narrative from the perspective of somebody who was part of radical Islam, saw it, didn't like it, and left and is now fighting against it. I'm pleased to welcome to the stage Maajid Nawaz and Paul Carrillo.
I'll see you.
So let's get right into it. This question of what it's all about. Both of you were recruited into violent organizations, radical organizations at a very young age in very different contexts. And what I really want to get at is recruitment into a gang or recruitment into a radical Islamist group really that different? And so I want to begin with your personal stories and then tie it together. Paul, why don't you start?
Sure. Well, for me, I grew up in a very dysfunctional household. My father left when I was about 10 years old, and when he came around for about a year or two here and there, and it was just to abuse us or my mother. A lot of substance abuse at home. We lived in a low-income neighborhood. So, and then when he left, my mother started to abuse drugs and alcohol at an alarming rate after that. So, for me, I didn't want to be home, witnessing that and suffering from the abuse from my mother. So I kind of went to the streets, and that's where the gang members were. And it's kind of funny because I remember being 5 years old and despising my father's lifestyle because he was a gang member. And I hated the fact that the gang took him away from us. He ended up going to prison, committing crimes and whatnot. But when I turned 13, 14 years old, I ended up doing the same thing. How did that happen? Why did that happen? So the only logical explanation I can think of is I was looking for a way to vent, looking for a way out. And the guys on the streets accepted me and embraced me in large part because they knew me from my relations to my aunts, my uncles, my cousins. Everybody was a gang member. And they offered support, guidance, love, respect, identity, some of the simple basic stuff that every child should have, within their household with a mother and father and a cohesive family. I didn't have, and I found that in the gang.
Mm-hmm. Maajid, how does your experience compare? Were you religious growing up, or was this something that you came to?
I wasn't religious, and I would like to actually use this opportunity to try and smash a lot of the myths around Islamist radicalization. There are so many factors that Paul and I in conversation we have in similar to why I joined at 16 Hizb ut-Tahrir, but there are also things that are not similar. So I come from an educated background. I'm a law graduate. I studied Arabic. I did my master's in the London School of Economics. And I had a very agnostic childhood, and my mother raised me in a very liberal way. Most people who join Islamist organizations do not come from the mosques. They come from the background that I've come from. Let's take two most famous examples. Bin Laden is from one of the richest families in Saudi Arabia. He's an engineer. And his deputy, Ayman Zouahri, is a doctor. He's a pediatrician from one of the most prestigious families in Egypt. But what is the similarity here is in discussions over breakfast and lunch, we've realized that I also suffered from an acute identity crisis. I was born and raised in the UK. My family is originally from Pakistan. And I was forced at a very young age, around 14, 15 years old, to watch some very, very violent racist attacks. But they weren't particularly against me. What would happen is this group called Combat 18, I suppose I can drop that brand at least on this platform. They're not in danger of becoming popular. This group used to run around the streets of my hometown, and I only had white friends because there weren't many people who looked like me from my town. But they would hold me back whilst forcing me to watch my friends get stabbed before my very eyes because they considered them blood traitors for having befriended me. So there was these very racist and violent attacks, hammer attacks on people's heads, people being stabbed multiple times. But then combined with that, there was constant police harassment. So it didn't matter that I was from a middle-class background, educated, and was trying to make something of my life. My brother was 16. He was playing with a plastic pellet gun. I was 15 years old, and an old lady saw him and decided he must be about to rob a bank. And so at 15 years old, I was arrested at gunpoint by police for suspicion of armed robbery. None of the people that attacked my friends were ever convicted, but there was me constantly being arrested and harassed by the police because at the time it wasn't, this is long before 9/11, it didn't have anything to do with Islam, but it was because of my skin color and people that assumed certain things about my background. So this made me feel very disconnected from the society where I was born, and I was in search of an identity. And in political Islam, I call it Islamism, and it's not the same as Islam, the faith. In Islamism, I found an ideology, I found an identity, and I found a belonging, exactly as Paul described. And that's where I think we have very similar stories.
Well, this is interesting because, going back to this notion that it's all about ideology, right? It doesn't sound like what we're talking about here is a religious ideology, And so, when we were having lunch yesterday, I asked you, Paul, the question: is there an ideology of the streets? It's not religious, obviously, but can you describe an ideology of the streets that actually sounds similar to Maajid's, or is it really something very different?
It's probably different in the sense that when I first joined the gang, there was a lot of talk and a lot of behavior. The viewpoint of us against the world. Nobody cares about us. All the rich people on top of the hill could care less if we kill each other. It probably benefits them in some sort of way. Why should we obey the law? Just stuff of that nature. Underprivileged. Got to fend for ourselves and maybe even have to rob, cheat, and steal to feed our families, stuff of that nature.
Mm-hmm. I think where the commonalities is the grievances that we experience and the identity crisis that leads to people seeking a belonging in something. And I think that there weren't gangs. I mean, Europe it's not the same as America in that sense. We don't have those armed gangs running around with guns. What we do have instead is a heavy Muslim population. Some say that the blacks of Europe are the Muslims. And then what we have is a situation where in seeking that identity, they're joining extremist organizations. And it's quite a huge problem in Europe, in the UK, and across the continent.
Now, we've gotten at the grievances and the motivational needs that led you, Paul, to join a gang, Maajid, you to join Hizb ut-Tahrir. What about the decision to leave? What were the grievances or motivational needs behind both of your very difficult and potentially life-threatening decisions to leave these organizations, which is something that is damn near impossible for most people?
Let me try to sum this up in about 30 seconds. There was a young kid who kind of idolized me, followed me around, wanted to be like me, and I was kind of mentoring him in the gang. And I remember one particular incident. There was a party in my neighborhood, and a guy from an outside neighborhood tried to stab one of my friends. He didn't know that was our territory, so long story short, we chased him down, and he was getting beat by about 10 guys. And all of a sudden, this kid taps me on the shoulder, and I turn around, and it's a 10-year-old, 11-year-old kid holding a turtle. And he says, "Here, hit him with this." And it was just mind-boggling, like, what is this kid doing out at midnight? Why is he offering me his pet turtle to hit this guy with, right? So come to find out, this kid's father had left him when he was 3 years old, started a new family in Mexico. His mother remarried, and his stepdad can't stand him. So the family goes out on, family parties on the weekend, and he stays home by himself. So he was just looking for acceptance. And I tried to convince the younger guys to keep him out of the gang, but he kept begging to be a part of it. So for me, fast forward maybe a year or two later, within a period of a couple of weeks, I found myself getting involved in some organized crime. And this guy kept ending up on my doorstep, and I said, "Gosh, I got to get away from this guy. It's a level up from street gangs." some prison gang stuff. So he was arrested by the feds on a RICO charge. So that kind of helped. I didn't have to worry about him so much. My girlfriend got pregnant, and this young friend of mine was murdered. So I was at a bit of a crossroads. I said, okay, I'm really gonna go off the deep end now, because I've never really been that violent. I was more of an organizer in the gang. Each gang member plays different roles. Not every gang member is a killer or a drug dealer. So I was always the organizer. So I said, I'm really gonna go off the deep end and, avenge his death, or I'm gonna man up and take care of my child, which I always promised myself I would do. So I chose to be a man and take care of my daughter, and that's how it started for me.
Well, in my case, I mean, I yet am able to answer specifically why I took the decision I did, considering what happened in prison. Because most of the people, I mean, at the end of the day, if you've been through torture by electrocution, if you've had your friends die in front of your eyes in prison because they've been tortured, if you've seen 15-year-old boys electrocuted, and mothers electrocuted before their fathers, most people in that situation go from being non-violent extremists, as I was, to becoming terrorists. And I was on the verge of switching when I was in solitary confinement in Egypt to become a violent terrorist. What happened in my case is, whilst we were in prison in Egypt, Amnesty International adopted us as prisoners of conscience. And I had considered Amnesty as the enemy of my people. I'd considered human rights as a soft power tool of colonialism to colonize the minds of Muslims and make them subservient to Western values. When Amnesty reached out in that way, for the first time I saw a consistent stance in defense of people who they knew considered them as enemies. And that opened up my heart. And I think where the heart opens, the mind can follow. But secondly, I think very significantly in prison, I was there with those who assassinated the former president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, in 1981. Those who weren't executed in the case were given life sentences. And many of these former jihadists had abandoned their violent ideology through a constant process of discussion and dialogue and engagement with people who were involved in de-radicalization of the prisoners. And those guys then went on to speak to me. Now, initially, I took it upon myself to think that you guys have sold out, prison has made you soft, and it's my purpose to try and reconvince you of the fact that you've basically forgotten who you were. These guys had been in prison since I was, about 7, 8 years old. I mean, they had done time. And obviously, over the 4-year process, it was them who managed to change my mind and convince me that, in fact, what I had thought was Islam, my faith, was a very politicized version of Islam. It was exploiting sentiments of grievances and my emotional sentiments to my faith for a political ideology. So upon leaving, a year later, I decided to take that step and start working for human rights reconciliation and counter-extremism, i.e. to prevent people from ever joining extremist groups in the first place. Because I think it's very hard to convince people who've been through torture, or on a macro level, to convince people who've had their countries invaded and civilians have been bombed in front of their eyes. It's very hard to change them once they've been radicalized. But it's a lot easier to capture people who are youth, 60% of the world's population, before they join extremist organizations. And that's where we're working in Pakistan. That's where CBS 60 Minutes followed us there to profile that work. So I think what we're trying to do is stop people ever joining in the first place. Once they've gone down that path, it's very difficult to pull them back. The pressures you spoke about, I mean, it cost me my marriage. My ex-wife, who's a member of the group, I have a son with her. Our marriage ended, and all of the people that used to idolize me as a prisoner of that cause now consider me a traitor. And a couple of times have either threatened or have attacked me in Pakistan. So the pressures to leave these organizations are huge, even if you wanted to leave. And I think the best solution is, let's not bomb people, let's not introduce regressive legislation on Guantanamos and Abu Ghraibs. Let's start preventing the 60% of the world's population from ever joining those groups in the first place. Because once they join, the peer pressures to stop them leaving are so intense. I mean, who's going to want to have their marriage end up in a divorce? I mean, it's not something that every person wants to go through. So I think prevent is better than cure.
Well, I think this is a good opportunity to bring up technology, right? Technology is offers a set of tools that have been distracting young people for decades, and the technology we see today offers a potential to distract young people off the path of recruitment. But if you look at just the spike in technology, right, in the last 10 years, cell phone growth around the world has gone from 907 million to nearly 5 billion. Internet growth from 361 million to nearly 2 billion. But we all know that while technology doesn't choose sides, the people who use it do. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit from the gang context and the radical Islamist context about both the negative sides of how technology is being used, but also where some of the opportunities might be?
Sure. Well, for some of the kids that I work with, most of them have MySpace accounts. I don't know if it's okay to say MySpace, but so and And many of their profiles display their gang membership, if not a family member's gang membership. A lot of times there's even altercations that transpire on MySpace and kind of filter out into the streets. Not at an alarming rate, but it does happen. So, promoting of the gang, it helps to recruit members. They kind of add a kid who's kind of wanting to fit in. I see a kid, for example, a kid from South Central LA has a friend in, a suburb area, and he's kind of wanting to be from that gang, and he doesn't live in a poor neighborhood or has the same struggles as the kid from the gang. So just stuff of that nature. It's just, I don't know what to do, honestly. The best thing we can try to do is educate the parents. But a lot of times the parents are kind of thinking that it's the thing to do, just let them do what every other kid is doing, but that's not the case. But they do use, I wouldn't say email so much, but text messaging, hey, I just saw this member here. So, they go looking for the guy through text messaging and MySpace accounts and other social networks that help to promote and recruit.
Maajid, real quick, because then we're going to bring Alberto and Jeffrey back.
Well, since this is called Mind Shift, let's talk about some of the ways in which I think extremist organizations are thinking more innovatively than we are. They're addressing global populations. They're not recognizing national boundaries. Their message is global. Their recruitment is global. And they're using new media in ways. I was taught how to use the email by the extremist group that I joined at around 17 years old. I didn't know what email was. And they're active on social media. They're using the internet in amazingly efficient ways, considering their resources. And yes, technology is value neutral, so it depends on who's using it and how they use it. But I think we need to be a lot more imaginative as to how we're using that technology to push out counter messages. And we need to stop thinking in a restricted national way. We need to stop thinking of the borders and the impositions we put on our own minds, but start thinking in imaginative and creative ways as to how we can move forward in the future to put out positive messages via using technology and other forms of media, music and will.i.am and some of the work there. And I think it's vital to develop brands and symbols for counter-radicalization. Everyone's heard of bin Laden, everyone's heard of Al-Qaeda. Who's heard of the positive alternative messages out there to try and challenge those brands? And they are brands. And at the moment, those brands who are challenging them don't have enough attention or branding or symbolism around them to develop that potent counter-message.